Hi, I'm James Tarmy, a journalist with Bloomberg News and Businessweek magazine. We're here to talk about how to make a luxury condominium building that actually sells. And I have here with me Donna Olshan, the president of Olshan Realty and the author of the Olshan Luxury Report, which is read by pretty much everyone in the industry and many people outside of it as well. I'm here with Miki Naftali, who is the founder of the Naftali Group, which has a $12 billion portfolio. At least that's my understanding. And finally, there's Peter Pennoyer, a firm with offices in, Peter Pennoyer is the principal, partner of Pennoyer Architects, which has offices in New York and Miami, and which has done projects large and small, but usually grand around the globe. And so I actually would love to start it off with Donna to give an overview of the kind of high-end real estate market, and particularly the condominium market in New York City over the last few years, because that will hopefully contextualize things for what goes forward.
So from 2013 to 2015, I would call that the golden years of new development. And in those years, we had about 1,350 contracts signed at $4 million and above. $4 million and above is what we call luxury. And then 16, 17, and 18, there were about 1,150 on average in that number of contracts signed for the year. And then 2019, we were at around 935, which was low. And we were starting to come out of it in January of 2020, but then we hit an absolute wall with the pandemic. So the market fell down to the low 600 range, and we were in very bad shape because of the pandemic, once in 100 years. So 2020 ended up to be a garbage year. It was really tough. And now what happened in November of 2020 was the news of the vaccine a couple of days or a week after the election. And that triggered a market revival of a lot of pent-up demand that was there. And since November, we've been on a trajectory. And leading the way was this particular boutique building called the Benson at 1045 Madison, which was very unique. It came out, there might have been one sale in the summer of 20, but basically it came out at the end of September 20, and it had a wonderful arc and rise and sold really, really well. And it led the market, and I think it's only 13 or 14 units, but it certainly hit the top of my report at least 4 times as the #1 sale of the week from November. So that's the long and the short of it. And now I turn it back to you.
Well, and so for context, the Benson was designed by Peter and built by Miki. But before we kind of speak about that, I'd also like to, Donna, just briefly speak about what wasn't selling, as well as what was. Were there, you've just described a sort of you in terms of sales. What is sort of left in the trough, and what do you? Well, let's hear about that.
There's a lot of supply. There's probably at least a 5 to 6 year supply of condominiums north of $4 million. There's a lot of pressure on other developers to clear their inventory. Co-ops also have been dragging. Condos normally outsell co-ops 3 to 1. Now it's close to 4 to 1. So what's not selling is things that are overpriced. Everything is price sensitive. If you price it right, it will go. But if you're a developer and you gave rosy projections and you're hanging on to your inventory and you're hoping by switching marketing teams or whatever you're doing that that's going to work, it probably won't. it comes down to pricing things correctly from the outset. And if you don't price it correctly, you've got to change your course, and you've got to get the price down. But of course, there are many developers who are hamstrung by banks or mezzanine financing, and they just, they can't get their prices down.
This is, I mean, it's a fascinating phenomenon because there's still, I think, a perception of such a huge boom, at least when you look around the city and you see all of these skyscrapers going up, you see all of these cranes, and yet there's this kind of subtext of a total, not a total, but a real diminishment of demand. And so I think this is a good moment to turn to you, Miki, and talk about what the kind of phenomena that Donna has just described, what that's actually meant for you, and what that has kind of meant for your business and the way you think about building buildings.
Right. So, look, we started to work on the project on 1045 Madison Avenue, which is the Benson, a couple of years ago. So we obviously were very excited to collaborate with Peter and his team, and we put together a fantastic team to design this, frankly, once in a lifetime location. There are certain type of buyers that the only place that they will buy in New York City is anywhere between Park Avenue to Fifth Avenue, and anywhere between, I would say, the mid 60s to high 80s. And when you look at this very small geographic area, very, very small, there is nothing new. There is nothing new. There is definitely not in a condominium structure. There is nothing new. There are some fantastic, beautiful older buildings. The majority of them are co-op buildings, but most of them, they have no amenities. They have relatively small windows. Their mechanical systems are old. You can hire a fantastic architect like Peter and do an unbelievable renovation, but you can't really renovate the building. You can renovate your own apartment, you can combine apartments, but you can't really renovate the elevators, you can't renovate the lobby, because that's obviously part of the rest of the space that belong to the other residents in the building. So when we put together the team, we, and selecting Peter with his fantastic aesthetic and understanding of the Upper East Side, we wanted to design a building that will sustain basically almost every type of market, and not to build a building that would be maybe relevant for a year or 2 years, and 10 years after that look like, okay, just it's an old building, or maybe it's a building that is, very, very nice for a certain period of time, but not going to last a very, very long time. And I think it proved itself, because when we were building the superstructure, remember, we were at the beginning of last year. COVID hit all of us very, very difficult. And we were planning to open the sales office last April 2020. And at the beginning of March of last year, I said, let's hold on, let's hold off, let's make sure that we didn't know where the market is heading. And then while we were building the project, we started to get, and the superstructure was coming up, we started to get more and more inquiries about the building. People, different buyers and different brokers wanted to get information about the building. So at that point of time, which Donna said, she reminded all of us how terrible last year was. But remember, in addition to all of that, we had the election. And think about September of last year. Everything was about COVID and the election. Completely, the media, the coverage was only about that, only about COVID, the election, and how terrible the New York City market, the residential market was. And at that exact time, we decided to open the sales office. So late September of last year, we opened the sales office, and very quickly, we started to get a very, very good response. Now, going back to what Donna said, she's 100% right. We always, at the Benson and any other project that we do, we want to make sure that when we go to market, we price the project right. That's very, very important. We are not making up numbers like, okay, we're going to charge $6,000 a foot, $7,000 a foot. Why? Because that's what we think. No. So we do a lot of research. Obviously, you know, we review very carefully Donna's reports, and we make sure that we price the project right. We don't leave money on the table. You know, it's not cheap by any mean of imagination, but we came out to market at a fair, high price, but fair price, and very quickly we were selling basically on a weekly basis very, very expensive apartments when no one else in the market was selling. So and in a matter of less than 6 months, we sold out.
So this is a really good time to interject, because what you've just described is you've created, in whatever way, a niche product that doesn't really exist. And this is why it's so interesting to speak with you. And I also think that this means it's a really great time to bring Peter in, because what you're describing and as a niche product is, in fact, in many respects, a more historical vernacular, and however you want to describe it, as classic architecture, which, Peter, obviously you are a practitioner of. And so I think what I would love to hear from you is really how, on a conceptual and tangible level, you conceive of classic architecture in terms of proportions, in terms of aesthetics, and also why, at this point, it's such a rarity, to the extent that people are rushing to buy this building, even with all these adverse conditions.
I mean, I think it's interesting first to think of the buildings that are most highly valued in the co-op market, the Candela buildings, you know, 740 Park, 965th. And what's interesting is that those architects were solving a very different problem than we are today. They were looking at apartments that had to have 4 or 5 staff rooms, a break room for staff. And the problem we're solving is how to bring all the back of what used to be the back, the kitchen and sort of all the less formal spaces, and integrating them with the living spaces and making it more spacious and giving it flow, but still maintaining that sense of proportion that you have real rooms. You don't just have this sort of floating space feeling that you do in some more contemporary buildings. And those are really strategic decisions which we worked with Naftali at the beginning, and it has to do with the technical thing, which is where you put the elevators and fire stairs and all that. So in those older buildings, those elements essentially created a mask between the living room and the dining room, the formal spaces, and everything in the back. And in some of those buildings, it's very hard to pull those things together. So I think what we have learned is that people really do want real rooms. They also want proportion. They want windows with mullions. They want moldings. But they really do want to be able to have a kitchen that at times can be opened up to the front of the house. And that's, I think, one of the key differences. The amenities are obviously also important. And the fact is, there, I think, is a myth that things aren't built as well as they were. Well, in some respects, they're built better. You know, like the floors in the Benson were engineered by us, designed aesthetically, but they have soundproofing. They have things in them that you simply can't have, you know, you don't have in a 1920s building. So when we go back into one of these co-ops, we're trying to squeeze in the things that we were able to put in the Benson from the beginning, and that's, you know, that's a big difference. So it's you know, certainly there's this traditional aspect, but there's nothing like the planning. The planning's completely different.
That's fascinating. And you know, you obviously have built the Benson. You've built other larger buildings. Would you say that there has been pendulum shift in terms of commissions coming to you from various developers who are interested in these buildings? I mean, have you seen from 15 years ago the type of buildings that people want to today a difference or a development of some kind?
Absolutely. I think there's a real interest in rooms and having more traditional plans. I mean, I don't think any new development until Bob Stern did the 15 CPW for the Zeckendorfs, I don't think any new apartments had actual dining rooms, right? That was kind of a new thing. So I think all of these rooms are now seen as especially valuable for families, frankly, and for, smaller buyers, pied-à-terre buyers. So there's definitely a shift to interest in details, traditional details, real windows, and more defined architecture. Also, interior architecture that takes precedence over the structure, because there was this idea of kind of open space and seeing columns and beams, but now I think people want a more tailored approach, and that is something that you can create with traditional architecture.
So Miki, you obviously hit the bullseye with the Benson. Are we going to be seeing more quote unquote kind of classical architecture buildings, or are they more difficult to build, more expensive to build? Is there a barrier to us seeing more of this architecture?
No, so it really depends. I mean, we all speak about New York or Manhattan as like one neighborhood, but it's really not. It's so neighborhood specific. The type of building that we design and built on Madison Avenue and the Benson, and we have a second project that is coming on 1165 Madison, is a different product and different type of buyers than in downtown Manhattan, in Lower East Side or Tribeca or Chelsea. So when we go and we acquire a site, or we create a site by buying certain amount of buildings and putting together what we call an assemblage to be able to develop a site, it depends on the neighborhood. Historically, we didn't develop projects that are cater only to or mainly to foreign buyers. So you don't see us on really in Midtown. You don't see us in other parts of the city that are really cater more to foreign buyers. I'm a strong believer that when you develop a residential project, you want to really try to understand who your customers are and put together the best team and develop the product that will fit your future customer. Because look, we don't know who is going to buy. So we listen to the brokers. We try to gather as much information as possible and try to understand what is really, where is the need in the market. So I would say that we are working on a very big project, another big project on the Upper East Side, 200 East 83rd Street. This is a very big tower, 50-story high, but it's still, because of it's the Upper East Side, it's a classical type of design. 1165 Madison, again, the same thing. They are not identical to each other, but the same type of language. But if we design something on the Lower East Side, we're not going to use the same type of architectural and style in a different neighborhood.
So I think that's an excellent point. Obviously demand is neighborhood specific. If we've seen one thing with the New York real estate market, it's that you can have too much of a good thing. And so, Donna, my question to you is whether or not you think that the success of the Benson and a few other projects are replicable, or if you think that there's going to be a certain saturation. Because, of course, if you're aiming a condominium project at a domestic or New York City specific market that's buying 13 million plus apartments, $13 million plus apartments, there's a finite number of those people. And so the question is, from where you're looking at from a market perspective, if there's going to be a saturation soon, or if this is potentially in some way a recipe for success going forward.
The recipe really is, of course, a terrific. You start with a great location, and then you've got to put the right design, as Miki said, and it's got to be appropriate to the area, appropriate to the demographic and then you absolutely have to price it right. It just doesn't matter if you have built the best product in the world. If you don't price it right, you're out of the box. You can't connect with the people. So it's a bunch of factors. But I do think that with the Benson, he absolutely hit it right. Now, will people try to duplicate it? They'll definitely study it. But they also have to study the fact that what they did is they priced this around averaging a blended average of like 370, a little more than 3,700 to 3,800 a foot. So it just didn't hit that $4,000 a square foot thing that where you might hit the wall and not be able to convert. And other people just aren't converting. Their pricing is too high. But they did do a lot of, Peter did a lot of beautiful things with the architecture. They captured the light. They had the high ceilings. They didn't have soffits. They did, just as he described, these little things like insulating the floor. Those are things that people appreciate. And by the way, the buyer out there the condo market is benefiting because because people are tired of the co-op market. Right. They don't want to have that difficult entrance and exit. They want something renovated. And if it's renovated well and it's priced right and the location's great, you're going to win. But you got to get it all right.
So, Peter, I would love for you to have the last word in a certain respect, because ultimately it all comes down to the building's design itself, right? You can talk about the market, you can talk about the buyer, you can talk about pricing, but really it comes down to how a building is designed. And so what I would love to hear from you is if you have a sort of platonic ideal of the size of a building itself and the size of an apartment itself. Can there be a beautiful 70-story building? What are the actual proportions of the buildings and what are the proportions of the apartments?
In terms of the size of the building, I think there are two parts of it. One is how it treats the street and the cityscape at the scale of our experience as pedestrians, and the other is how it treats the skyline. So I absolutely think you could do beautiful buildings that are tall, as long as they integrate well with the neighborhood they sit in. So I don't think that's an issue. I think it's more, the developer investing in the materials and the sense of permanence you get, for instance, from a limestone building, even if it is more modern, is a completely different feeling in my mind than a curtain wall building. And I think that Naftali, in this case, let us do dimensional limestone, which means that there are details that people really don't do very often. And I do, even though it's not in your apartment, the building feels like it's going to be there, which it will be forever. And I think that has a very different feeling than some of the residential that feels like it's almost commercial in the kind of curtain wall aspect. As far as the ideal size, I think you can make, smaller compact apartments, larger ones. I think it has to do with tailoring the space in a very thoughtful way. And we've all seen plans that work, where you come in and you feel welcome and excited and you get the light. And in this building, we're able to actually have north and south windows in the enfilade, the rooms all along Madison. And that doesn't happen very often, right? It has to do with the setbacks and sort of taking advantage of certain zoning rules. So in that sense, I think it's the alignment of the aesthetic, the materials, and making the zoning work for you and making the apartments fit into the puzzle.